They stood outside a locked door at the bottom of the Atlantic, listening to the reactor room breathe like a beast with a fever. It was July 4th, 1961. The Arctic night was thick and black above them. Below, metal groaned, pumps screamed, and an alarm cut through the stale air of the submarine K-19. What happened next would change more than the lives of those men. It would expose the human cost of a navy racing to match its enemy and reveal a secrecy so complete that the true toll was hidden for decades. K-19 was supposed to be an answer. Built as Project 658 by Soviet yards that were pressured to deliver fast, the boat was the Navy's reply to the era's strategic imperatives: longer-range missiles, continuous patrols, deterrence at sea. Speed mattered. Deadlines mattered more than caution. Engineers at the Rubin Design Bureau raised concerns. Shipyard workers muttered about parts rushed into service, about systems mated without thorough testing. The new reactor plant, compact, powerful, and complex, arrived with manufacturing irregularities, and from the first months of its life, K-19 collected small accidents like a vessel collecting barnacles, electrical fires, bulky pumps, a string of mechanical failures that made sailors whisper superstitions about bad luck and a curse. But superstition can't explain metallurgy, or why a single sensor tube, a thin, delicate component inside the reactor, would fail. On that pre-dawn in July, a micro-crack, traced later to factory overpressure and stress, gave way. At 4:15 a.m., instrumentation blinked to zero pressure. The reactor's coolant, the water that carries away heat from the core and keeps everything within safe limits, started to escape. With coolant gone, the reactor's temperature rose rapidly. Pumps, already stressed by poor maintenance and metal fouling, began to jam. Alarms multiplied. Inside the control room, readings scrolled toward a number engineers dread, core temperatures climbing past 400 degrees Celsius. In those numbers lay a concise, clinical sentence of doom. Without emergency cooling, a full reactor meltdown was possible. With a melted core aboard a nuclear ballistic missile submarine, the results could be catastrophic, both for the crew and for any nation that misread the signals. Captain Third Rank Nikolai Zateyev called his officers. There were no easy answers. The boat's reactors, sealed, engineered for a different life at sea, had no designed, tested contingency for the particular cascade now unfolding. There was no spare game plan in a manual for this specific failure. The choices were stark. Allow the reactor to overheat and risk a violent release of radioactive materials, possibly contaminating the sea and exposing nearby ships. Or attempt an improvisation that might keep the core intact, but would likely expose men in the ship's reactor compartment to lethal radiation. Zateyev chose to act. "They had no other choice," is a phrase that feels at once cruel and true. To understand why, you have to understand what the reactor meant in that moment. Not just a stack of metal and fuel rods, but a bomb-shaped risk, a political instrument, a part of the balance of terror that defined the Cold War. A visible nuclear catastrophe, smoke, radiation plumes, or frantic SOS signals might have been interpreted by any watcher as the prelude to escalation. Preventing that worst-case outcome meant risking a more immediate human calamity on K-19 itself. The men who stepped forward did so with an awareness of what they were volunteering for. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov, commander of the reactor control group, organized the teams. Korchilov and a crew of volunteers descended into the bowels of the submarine, towards the reactor compartment, carrying makeshift welding gear, flashlights, and nothing like adequate shielding. Radiation dosimeters, the instruments meant to measure exposure, registered horrifying numbers as they approached, readings in the tens of sieverts per hour. For context, a single whole-body exposure of 1 sievert can cause radiation sickness. 4 to 5 sieverts is often lethal without intensive medical care. Levels above 8 sieverts are typically fatal even with treatment. In the reactor room of K-19, some readings reached 50 to 60 sieverts per hour. Those were levels that destroyed tissue within minutes and guaranteed a deadly dose in the short span of their work. What they did next was an act of macabre ingenuity. With trained emergency procedures non-existent for the failure before them, the teams improvised a repair, weld a bypass, restore circulation, and get coolant moving again. That work required cutting through insulation, penetrating shielding, handling pipes swollen by heat, and welding in an environment that was not merely hot, but saturated with penetrating radiation. They ran piping and pumps, rigged improvised seals, and forced seawater into circuits it had never been meant to touch. In the control room, men watched instrument needles twitch back from a precipice. Outside the reactor door, volunteers worked in a heat and light that would become the last remembered clarity of many of their lives. They did not do this blindly. They wrapped themselves in whatever protective garments were available, but those materials could barely slow the gamma radiation slamming into them. They inhaled radioactive aerosols. They absorbed doses far beyond what the human body can repair. Some stood through the work with grim calm, some vomiting, some trembling, some with the skin already reddening and blistering. Lieutenant Korchilov continued until his legs gave out. He collapsed and was carried out. He knew the cost. He accepted it. Back on the bridge, Captain Zatayev watched the reactor temperature begin, at last, to fall. The emergency measures had not been elegant or textbook. They were raw and desperate. But they worked well enough. The core cooled. The immediate risk of a catastrophic release was averted, and the boat surfaced to radio for help. The distress call did not unfold smoothly. K-19's long-range communications had been damaged earlier in the incident, and the backup systems were failing. Protocol in the Soviet Navy, like other navies, emphasized radio silence during patrols. To break silence was to invite scrutiny, possibly even interception by the West, and yet, with a radioactive reactor aboard and men dying below decks, silence would have been complicity. S-270, another Soviet submarine in the area commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Jan Sverbilov, violated radio silence and responded. Crews transferred the most wounded. Infected clothing was stripped from men who had been bathed in radiation and hastily bagged. At sea, procedures for contamination management were primitive. Clothing and personal effects of those exposed were often left behind, or sequestered because the ship itself was tainted. K-19 was towed to the nearest friendly port for decontamination. The effort to save the men, and to conceal a political embarrassment at the same time, set the stage for a different kind of damage. Medical facilities ashore scrambled to treat the most critically exposed. Radiation injury is a specific and terrible pathology. It follows a pattern, an early prodrome of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea that can begin within hours, a deceptive latent phase where symptoms appear to abate, followed by a manifest illness driven by the destruction of rapidly dividing cells, chief among them bone marrow. When marrow is destroyed, the body's ability to produce immune cells collapses. Patients become vulnerable to infection, bleeding, and sepsis. High-dose radiation also damages the lining of the gut, the skin, and the pulmonary system. In the worst exposures, even intense modern medical care cannot reverse the damage. Doctors at Soviet hospitals performed the best treatments available then: wound care, blood transfusions, antibiotics, and in some cases bone marrow transplants and transfusions that were intended to replenish the destroyed marrow and immune cells. These were serious interventions, but at exposures on the order of tens of sieverts, they were often insufficient. Over the following months, 22 of K-19's crew would die as a consequence of their radiation exposure. Men who had been part of the team that saved their ship became the first casualties of a near catastrophe. They were not mourned publicly. In many cases, their deaths were recorded with euphemistic causes or omitted entirely. Official records were altered. Reports that later became available after the Soviet Union began to open declassified files revealed a pattern: falsified logs, non-disclosure agreements imposed on survivors, and secret burials. Some of the bodies were interred quickly and quietly, sometimes in zinc coffins to reduce contamination risk. Families were told little. The state chose silence over transparency. For decades, the full accounting of what happened on K-19 remained obscured behind security classifications and the habit of secrecy that characterized Soviet naval administration. Declassified naval reports and survivor testimonies, released years later, paint the picture in grainy detail. They confirm the technical chain of events: a ruptured sensor tube leading to coolant loss, pumps that failed under stress, core temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, and a desperate improvisation by volunteer teams who entered a lethal environment to weld and restore circulation. They also confirmed the human cost, the immediate casualties from radiation, the long-term health consequences for survivors, and the official attempts to minimize public awareness. For those who prefer academic sources, naval investigation records and interviews collected by historians provide the documentation. For others, memorials and museum exhibits now stand where silence once ruled. The nickname that clung to K-19 Hiroshima was given by crew and opponents in quiet corners, a grim shorthand for the exposure and the danger the boat represented. It reflected both fear and a bitter gallows humor about being associated with nuclear catastrophe. K-19 returned to service for a time, despite the stigma and the damage, then suffered further incidents in later years. It was eventually decommissioned and broken up in 1990. The story did not end at the hull's scrapping. It entered the geography of memory. Memorials to the crew went up. The sailors who had volunteered became symbols in a larger debate about military secrecy, duty, and the ethics of orders in an era of nuclear brinksmanship. In 2006, Mikhail Gorbachev cited the human lessons of incidents like K-19's when he nominated those involved for the Nobel Peace Prize, an odd belated recognition that highlighted the moral complexity of honoring sacrifice while criticizing the systems that demanded it. To make sense of why people volunteered for certain death, it helps to return to the personal. Lieutenant Boris Korchilov did not die as a heroic abstraction. He was a man with colleagues and a command to uphold. He led because he felt responsible for the machinery and the lives it controlled. Captain Zateyev later testified to the agonizing choice between exposing his men to lethal doses and allowing a reactor to overheat in a way that could, in the eyes of other powers, signal a catastrophe or even an attack. These are human decisions wrapped in technical jargon and political consequence. They are choices made under pressure, moral pressure, as real as metal fatigue. How exactly did the improvised fix work? The technical anatomy is simple to describe, though complex in execution. A submarine reactor uses water as its coolant. That water circulates through a closed primary loop, carrying heat away from the fuel assemblies. The sensors that monitor pressure and flow are small but vital. When a sensor tube ruptures, coolant escapes from the closed circuit into the surrounding compartment. Pressure drops and flow falls. If flow falls enough, localized heating can cause fuel cladding to fail, exposing more material and potentially throwing off aerosols and heat. In K-19's case, the crew opened auxiliary circuits and fabricated a bypass to force seawater into the cooling loop. Seawater is corrosive and not ideal for a reactor's internal systems, but in an emergency, it acts as an acceptable temporary coolant. Welding such a bypass under radiation meant that the men were shielding neither themselves nor the work area adequately. They accepted that their presence would be a lethal exposure, and they acted to buy the ship a chance. Medical staff later observed the full clinical arc of acute radiation syndrome among the most exposed: immediate vomiting and nausea, a latent period during which, paradoxically, some patients seemed to stabilize, and then catastrophic failure weeks later as infections took hold and bleeding could not be stopped. Bone marrow transplants were attempted for several of the most promising cases, an intervention aimed at repopulating the immune system. In some instances, marrow from relatives was used. In others, marrow was sourced from other donors. These procedures, while cutting edge at the time, had limited effectiveness against the scale of cellular destruction at very high doses. The record shows that some men were temporarily sustained, others succumbed within weeks or months. Survivors carried with them not only physical scars, but a medical history of vulnerability that affected the rest of their lives. Hidden beneath this human tragedy was the institutional response: containment and obfuscation. The Soviet authorities prioritized national security and control over candid disclosure. Records were marked, sanitized, or hidden. Families were sometimes given alternative causes of death on paper. Survivors were pressured into silence by the culture and by officially required non-disclosure agreements. Only after decades passed, when historians gained access to declassified documents and when survivors felt able to speak more freely, did a clearer accounting become public. The photographs that emerged, grainy clinical shots of bandaged men, the boat being towed under an overcast sky, memorial plaques, tell a parallel story to the official logs. From a policy standpoint, K-19's accident was a wake-up call. Submarine reactor design and maintenance protocols evolved. The need for redundant safety systems, realistic emergency procedures, and non-judgmental reporting channels became clearer. Navies learned a hard lesson about the cost of compressing timelines on nuclear technology. Yet learning is not the same as restitution. The men who paid with their lives received little immediate recognition or support. It took political change, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the slow opening of archives, for full acknowledgement and memorialization to grow. There is an ethical dimension embedded in the sequence of events. When a state builds dangerous machines with human operators inside them, responsibility extends beyond the immediate acts of bravery. It encompasses the decisions that shaped design choices, the pacing of construction, the insistence on patrol schedules over testing, and the institutional secrecy that prevented candid safety assessments. K-19's tragedy is thus both the story of courageous individuals and of an organizational system that placed political and strategic goals above transparent engineering prudence. Yet for all the systemic critique, the heart of the story remains human. Men like Lieutenant Korchilov walked into a room where the physics of radiation promised unimaginable harm because the alternative, allowing uncontrolled reactor degradation, felt like an even greater harm. Many of those volunteers knew their odds. Some were fathers and sons. Some wrote letters or left small tokens with the living. The image that lingers is not of cold, faceless state action, but of faces lit by welding arcs, hands steady on tools, and a small group of individuals choosing to shoulder a burden they could not imagine surviving. The shock of the incident came from the collision of three truths: the brutality of radiation on the human body, the improvisational courage of the men who walked into that radiation, and the willful silence that followed. The secrecy worsened the hurt. It marginalized the dead and left families in the dark for years. Over time, memorials and museums tried to correct the record. Names were engraved, plaques were set up, documentaries, books, and declassified files replaced silence with testimony. The nickname Hiroshima stayed as a reminder, a cauterized wound that no ceremony could fully soothe. There are finer technical lessons to draw: the value of redundancy in critical systems, the need for robust sensor design and testing, the dangers of welding or modifying reactor systems without full radiological protection, and the imperative that crews be trained to recognize and respond to complex failures without risking routine exposure to lethal doses. But those lessons are sterile unless they are tied back to people. For every engineering improvement, there are names: Korchilov, Zateyev, Sverbilov, and dozens of crewmen who did not have the chance to live out the consequences of policy changes made later. The official tally of those who died from radiation exposure in the immediate and delayed aftermath of the accident stands at 22. That number is factual and clinical. Behind it are stories. Some died within days, overwhelmed by infections that a bone marrow can't fight when it has been destroyed. Others lingered, living with chronic conditions and a shortened lifespan. Many more carried psychological scars, the knowledge that they had been endangered by a system that then treated their suffering as a state secret. The medical attempts, transfusions, marrow grafts, experimental procedures, were hope in the face of physiology. They bought time, and for a few, survival. For others, the interventions were too late. K-19's legacy is neither a single moral nor a simple redemptive arc. It is a knot of lessons about engineering hubris, about the pressures of geopolitics, and about the capacity for human sacrifice. It is also a story about secrecy and the slow, halting process of recognition. In the years after the accident, the Soviet Navy changed some procedures. Internationally, the incident contributed to an emerging awareness that naval nuclear safety could not be left to closed doors. For historians and ethicists, the event raises ongoing questions about how states balance secrecy and public safety, how institutions care for those they risk, and how societies remember the hidden costs of national power. The men who repaired K-19 did something simple and terrible. They traded their lives for the ship, and for what their superiors imagined the ship represented. Whether that trade was necessary in the abstract is less important than the immediate fact. Those men volunteered with eyes open, and they paid the price. Their sacrifice kept a dangerous possibility from becoming a visible catastrophe. It prevented a political signal that might have been misinterpreted by adversaries. It kept radiation from being broadcast into the world on a scale that would have alarmed navies and governments everywhere. When the truth finally emerged, through declassified reports, survivor interviews, and independent scholarship, it was shocking not because it revealed a fantastical conspiracy, but because it revealed human choices and institutional blindness. The most agonizing part of the disaster was not the reactor's heat or the radiation's invisible cruelty alone. It was the combination of those forces with secrecy that compounded grief and delayed justice. Today, memorials bear names, museums display fragments and documents, naval engineers lecture on improved safeguards. Yet the most immediate memorial is the memory kept by families and by the few survivors who spoke up when they could. In a world that spun closer to catastrophe because states kept nuclear arsenals on hair-trigger alert, a small group's improvisation aboard a Soviet submarine quietly kept the world from seeing one potential crisis. The cost of that quiet was measured in human lives. If you want to go deeper into the archives, there are declassified naval reports, interviews with survivors, and detailed technical analyses that reconstruct the timeline and the engineering failures. Those sources make clear what was wrong with K-19's design and what might have been done differently. They also provide names and dates: July 4, 1961, the rusted sensor tube traced to factory overpressure, temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, radiation levels in the reactor compartment reaching tens of sieverts per hour, 22 fatalities attributable to radiation exposure, the boat's eventual decommissioning in 1990, and the later efforts to memorialize the crew and acknowledge the truth. If this account matters to you, and you want more source-driven history like this, subscribe for more. There are longer reads and primary documents that go beyond an overview, technical reports, survivor interviews, and archival material that illuminate both the engineering and the human stories. We close with a reverent reminder: the shocking truth behind K-19 is not a single scandal, but a constellation of consequences, design decisions made in haste, brave and desperate action in the face of catastrophe, and a state apparatus that chose silence over accountability. The men who entered that reactor compartment were not anonymous statistics. They were sailors, volunteers, fathers who accepted a fate so that others might live. Remembering them is not merely an exercise in history. It is an ethical duty, an insistence that human lives be counted, named, and honored. For those who want to learn more, links to the documented sources, survivor interviews, and declassified reports are included in the description. If you found this narrative meaningful, consider supporting deeper research and preservation efforts through the links provided. Above all, carry forward the story of K-19 not as an abstract lesson in Cold War danger, but as a testament to real people who faced an agonizing choice, and in doing so, changed the course of events beneath a dark Arctic sky.